Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next session. My name is Steve Chapman, and I'm the Vice-Chancellor of Edith Cowan University and Chair of the Higher Education Standards Panel. So look, I'm very keen in this session that we get a lot of questions, so please look at the Ask Question button and get those questions in. Let me introduce the speakers we've got today. So we have Emeritus Professor Valerie Braithwaite from RegNet, the Australian National University. Ms. Saxon Rice, the Chief Executive Officer from the Australian Skills Quality Authority, and Mr. Alistair Maclean, the Chief Executive Officer of TEQSA. So what I'll do is do a kind of brief secondary scene, and then we'll go over to our speakers and have a lot of questions at the end of it. I'm coming from the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to all of their elders. So with that, let's kick off. Unfortunately, I noticed that many of you feel a bit of pandemic fatigue. I noticed that in the questions in the chat. Unfortunately, our session has the name Pandemic in it, so we are going to be addressing that. Hard lessons, responsive regulation in a pandemic. If I take all of us back to early 2020, all of our institutions received a letter from TEQSA. You might remember this, Alistair. And the letter asked us for a lot of information. I guess we were wondering at the time, would this be Harlem's metaphorical swamp raising its head, and that we would be burdened by regulation whilst trying to deal with a pandemic, which was a worry. As you remember, that was rolled back. It was rolled back, I think, very well. TEQSA made a number of concessions in relation to regulation, including reporting requirements, relaxed fee payments, etc. And I think that was well received. We also got some really good provision of online learning for offshore students who required many regulatory concessions, and those concessions were also good. And I think also TEQSA provided after some consultation with the sector, we were all involved in that, some good practice online in terms of teaching guides for the sector. And I think certainly at our institution that went down very well. So I would suggest that whilst there were a lot of issues, we were having to deal with a lot of things, in terms of regulations, there were some good examples that we'll probably hear about them today, as well as some of the things that perhaps didn't go. So with that sort of brief introduction, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Valerie Braithwaite. Valerie, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. And Yama, hello from Ngunnawal country, which is in Canberra. The paper I'm going to give today, we've decided to restrict ourselves to 5 minutes so we have lots of time for conversation and questions. But I did put a copy of the paper, Hard Times, on my personal website, valeriebraithwaite.com. In that paper, I make 5 points. The first point is that we've learned through the pandemic that the data that is held by regulators is really not that helpful in knowing who's going to cope and who's not going to cope with the pandemic. We only measure certain things. We often measure the things that are easiest. And of course, it's backward data, not telling us what's going to happen as we go forward. So that's my first point. Data is incredibly useful for us as providers to see what our weaknesses are and our strengths and plan ahead. But in a pandemic, we need a whole lot more than that to get through and to regulate the sector. This is my second point, the importance of case managers. Case managers can document the problems that a provider is having, but also connect a provider with who might be able to help. They're part of important communication networks in a pandemic. And, you know, as we all know, communication is everything when this sort of thing happens. So that's the second point that I make, the importance of a skilled, experienced a case manager to be at the front and to make sure that the regulator doesn't become, completely out of touch with what's going on. That's the other really important function of the case manager. The third point that I talk about there is something that's been talked about today, actually, and that is the amazing cooperation we saw in the sector. Now, I have always been a great advocate of the importance of cooperation for all our benefits. But in a pandemic in particular, I think it's reminded us of the advantages of actually having what I call geographic hubs of excellence in practice. And what I mean by that is that all providers in a particular geographical area get together. They have, for example, open house meetings where the public, where employers, parents, students, anyone who's interested, politicians, and of course, regulators come along to talk about whether that region is being served well. And that strikes me as important at the moment because we are concerned about this issue of diversity. We know the sector has always been a bit inclined to huddle together. Where one goes, others go. John Quiggin talked about this, and it's in the Wells report as well, that this is a potential danger in the future. My fourth issue is about accountability. Now, I would argue when all eyes are on quality in that kind of open house situation that I'm talking about, and you've got a good case manager who's documenting what's happening, then some of the accountability is taking place. But in the paper, I make a distinction between what I call dismissive defiance and resistant defiance. Now, resistant defiance, we all practice that to our regulators when they don't understand us, when they are not behaving in a way which is consistent with what we would call trustworthy norms. Resistant defiance is a signal to the regulator to start getting in touch. And when they do, we often cooperate, sometimes begrudgingly, but we go into a more cooperative mode. Dismissive defiance, on the other hand, is something quite different to that. And it occurs when the regulator is simply not respected. It doesn't have authority in the eyes of a provider in this particular case. Now, such providers are out there. I'm not saying they're the majority, they are certainly not. But if we think back to the vet fee help problems, we know that they are in our midst. And dismissive defiance and providers who practice dismissive defiance really take advantage of the opportunities presented by disruption. So this is my last point about accountability, which will frighten many of you, but I think I can argue the case for it, that for everyone, re-registration should be a very tough process. I remember asking a provider once if TEQSA was captured by providers, and the reply was, TEQSA was all over us. So my closing remark is that TEQSA needs to be all over everyone at re-registration. But I do think there are ways in which we can make that not a painful experience, but one that we can manage quite well. And on that note, Steve, I hope I've kept my commitment to you to be brief.
That was absolutely perfect, Valerie. Thank you very much. Very interesting comment there, which I'm sure will elicit quite a few questions. And I'm going to now hand over to Alistair for his comments. Alistair, over to you. On to you.
Thanks, Steve. Very much appreciated. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm speaking from Wurundjeri country, which is in Melbourne, of course, where TEQSA is located, and the majority of our staff, and we're slowly returning to the office, which is great. In my brief remarks, slightly different. I'll touch upon what Valerie has just said, but just to, and then recap what Steve said earlier in his introduction. I guess our first response in the pandemic was essentially through our existing settings and existing practices, if you like, capturing some low-hanging fruit. So we did things like relaxing application of the National Code to enable online learning, to streamline course accreditations, to develop practical guidance around providing for online offerings. And Valerie's point about collaboration, I think, is an important one. We as TEQSA attempted at least to, and I hope had a measure of success in a heightened level of engagement with the sector through the initial stages of the pandemic. And to make a bit of a point there, collaboration being very important, but also maintaining the independence of the regulator also being equally vital for performing our function properly. After that initial phase, however, which I think broadly was welcomed by the sector or from the sector, the next phase, if you like, for TEQSA was to grapple with some of the emerging risks at that time in a very fast-moving environment, and to start to think about what our regulatory response should be. And financial viability of providers was a clear emerging risk and remains so, and the potential for disruption across the sector and potential provider closures. So that was certainly a focus for TEQSA and remains so. And Valerie's point about data, I think, is well made. We're currently quite constrained in our capacity to actually follow live, if you like, the financial situation in the sector and for particular providers, and data challenges for us, and the lag in data is something that's a real challenge for TEQSA at the moment. Another area was impacts on international education, very clear as the emerging risks with border closures, the push, if you like, or the rapid transition to online and offshore and third-party arrangements for the delivery of offerings for international students, and what that might mean for our role as a regulator against the standards, and in particular around, for example, admission standards and learning quality. The student experience, given our sort of second fundamental role in protecting the interests of students, was again another area for ongoing focus from TEQSA, or by TEQSA, both through the move off campus in the initial phases of the pandemic, and now, whilst we're still in the pandemic, Steve, I don't think we're in any question out of it yet, and now transitioning to sort of hybrid or blended models as students return over the next 6 months to a year. And then finally, some integrity risks, of course, and academic integrity being one, and the serious integrity risk that commercial academic cheating services continue to pose to the sector, and how that may have changed through the course of the pandemic. And Valerie references there dismissive versus resistant defiance. I'd like to characterise our relationship with the sector, meaning that it's mostly resistant rather than dismissive. But I do think there are some risks out there presenting themselves, and that distinction that Valerie makes is well made. Got some further indicative challenges, and again they go to things like data lag and second wave impacts of the pandemic, and what our response should be as the regulator. There's now managing much greater diversity across the sector, both in the scale and the focus of providers, but now the type and the location and the mode of the delivery of their offerings. That's going to present some distinct regulatory challenges for TEQSA, and it goes to our model and practice, which Peter Coldrake referenced earlier today in his opening remarks. There will be no snapback. That's very clear, and we need to think through what that means for our regulatory position and posture and settings, if you like, both our legislative settings but also our practice as an agency. We're moving away, of course. The pandemic has thrown this into sharp relief. The assumptions of stability and growth in the sector have been blown away. There's what was a predominantly onshore, on-campus model for the bulk of services and offerings in the sector is now changing very rapidly. It was undergoing change in any case, but this is the pandemic has heightened and accelerated that at an enormous rate. So we need to move as a regulator to a more genuinely risk-based regulatory model and practice, and that's the challenge for TEQSA now, and the example of the particular demands for live data-fed analysis around things like financial viability as a key risk in the sector at present, and comprehensively informed regulatory posture and decisions that flow from that are going to be really critical. We're looking for genuinely collaborative sector relationships. I think that's vital, and that picks up on a point that Valerie made very well, whilst also maintaining our independence and actively managing the risks of regulatory capture. And a case manager model in that respect presents some challenges, and we need to continue to be kind of alive to those, whilst also taking advantage of the opportunities and the advantages that a case manager model presents for a regulator such as TEQSA. I suspect I've taken up my time, Steve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alistair. That was great. And we will now go to our third speaker, Saxon. Saxon, over to you.
Thanks, Stephen, and acknowledge my fellow panelists. I would like to focus on three key areas. I thought it might be useful to touch on some context in terms of the circumstances that ASQA, as the national regulator of the vet sector, and the vet sector itself, found ourselves in at the onset of the pandemic. And then I thought I'd give you a bit of a snapshot of the way in which we went about responding to the pandemic, noting that some of the differences in the regulatory environment between higher ed and vet. And I'll wrap up just with some of the key lessons that we've learned. So in relation to the first point, the onset of the pandemic really coincided with a lot of change for ASQA and the sector. Like higher ed, student numbers were impacted by the closing of borders. 3/4 of providers had shifted at least some of their training or assessment online. A change from what we'd actually seen prior to the pandemic, when about half of providers were using a mix of face-to-face and online delivery. And government had just released ASQA's rapid review, which saw us focused on responding to clear direction to expand our educative function, improve the way that we engage with providers, and shift our approach from a focus on input and compliance controls to a greater focus on self-assurance. So while at times a little chaotic, ASQA actually had some solid foundations upon which we could be much more responsive in our regulation of the sector than perhaps we may have been considered to have been in the past. The pandemic, in a lot of ways, actually helped us to fast track the implementation of many of the rapid review recommendations that related to our approach to engaging with the sector and the transparency of our risk focus. When it comes to responsive regulation of the vet sector, which for us includes almost 3,800 providers within our remit, around about 75 of which are dual sector providers. Whether it be responding to a global pandemic or any other high risk situation, our role is not so much to understand and respond to risk at the provider level, but rather to understand risks across the sector and deploy strategies more broadly to manage risk. We did this by developing a COVID-19 risk monitoring strategy early in the pandemic, which allowed us to really work with the sector to understand how providers were responding to the pandemic, to identify risks and implement strategies to manage those risks. Based on how providers told us that they were responding and the analysis of our own data, the three key risks identified were that some providers were seeking to add products to their scope of registration to meet changes in demand without sufficient industry engagement or expertise, or that providers were transitioning to online delivery without ensuring that they were set up to provide adequate support to students and validate online assessments, and or that others were unable to place students in work placements as part of mandatory assessment requirements. So we created some dedicated pages for advice and guidance on our website and social media, and that also included advice from within the sector about how providers themselves were managing and adapting their response to support students and to continue to ensure quality outcomes. Students were obviously a key stakeholder here, and we provided advice to them through the MySkills website to really support their choices about providers and courses in the circumstances. We also commenced a strategic review of online learning, which is exploring the opportunities and the risks of online learning, and it's being used to inform our regulatory approach and support providers to meet our expectations and deliver best practice in online learning. It's interesting actually to note that over a year on from the initial shift online, almost a quarter of providers have moved some training or assessment online, are continuing to deliver that way, whereas over a quarter have moved back to their pre-COVID approach to delivery. Not surprisingly, our regulatory risk priorities for this financial year include online learning as a risk focus, as well as our ongoing response to COVID and delivery in the international space, both onshore and offshore. At the height of the pandemic response, ASQA also supported broader government initiatives, including the work of the Australian Industry and Skills Committee Emergency Response Subcommittee. And that was particularly in developing solutions to respond to areas of workforce needs critical in supporting economic recovery. This included undertaking risk assessments that enabled the automatic approval of a cohort of providers to deliver new infection control training skill sets. So that supported us in our efforts to really amplify the voice of the regulator within the broader vet architecture, and it recognised the real value of the insights regulators can bring to policy considerations. So finally, some lessons. Not surprisingly, when it comes to data, the pandemic really highlighted some long-standing issues in terms of access to automated real-time data, particularly data relating to enrolments and completions, changes to modes of delivery and financial viability, and data to support our understanding of offshore delivery. A particular example here related to the concern raised by the sector in terms of the ability for students to access work placements during the pandemic and the ability of some training packages to allow flexibility in that regard. Data to support consideration of that issue wasn't easily found or available with any currency. ASQA's certainly taken that on board though, and we are working with the opportunity to make significant improvements in this area. We have a new data strategy which will very much help us to improve the quality of the data we collect, our identification of risks and tracking of impact, and the measurement of our own effectiveness as a regulator. We've also embarked on a digital transformation roadmap as a really significant contributor to our ability to be more efficient, effective, and responsive in the future. So I'm happy to leave my comments there, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Saxon. Thanks to all three of you for really setting the scene well. We've got a lot of questions that have come in. I want to take time to answer the most important question myself first, and that is this a biotapestry tie? Yes, it is a biotapestry tie. So with that important question answered, let's go to an even more important one. This goes right to the philosophy of what it is to be a regulator, I think, and how you interact with those you regulate. And the question is, can a regulator ever be a partner to the sector it regulates? What is the key element for a healthy relationship? So I think all three of you can contribute to that. I'll start with Alistair, then maybe go to Saxon, and Valerie, you can have the last word. So over to you.
Depends what you mean by partner. If it's a partnership, I think certainly we need to partner with the sector, but it needs to be done in such a way that those being regulated recognise and respect the independence and the functions of the regulator, and vice versa, of course. The regulator recognises the particular circumstances and situations that might apply to both the sector as a whole, and then also to individual providers or regulated entities within that sector. Of course, our legislation and the legislation that sits behind any regulator governs substantially both the type and the nature of the activity it undertakes. But within any regulatory framework, there's also considerable scope for a regulator to conduct itself in a particular manner. So where, as Valerie has highlighted, the value of collaboration whilst maintaining our independence and the respect of the sector, if you like, and hopefully always maintaining a defiant rather than dismissive posture on the part of the regulated entities towards TEQSA. I think mostly we have a sometimes robust but respectful relationship with our entities, sometimes maybe not quite so respectful and tending towards a dismissive, but in the vast bulk of circumstances it is. Re-registration, for example, is resource intensive, often quite long, subject to challenge, of course, the outcomes, and has been on numerous occasions, and can be subject to significant imposition of conditions, for example. But the bulk of providers, in my short experience in this role, have commented on how it's a great discipline for that provider in assuring themselves of meeting the standards and the higher education standards framework. So, if you like, it's a free audit in some respects, but I don't know, I'd leave it there for the moment, perhaps attract some further comments from Saxon and Valerie.
Saxon, over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Alistair. And look, I particularly acknowledge the comments that Alistair made around partnering. And from ASQA's perspective, for those that are familiar with the rapid review that was undertaken of ASQA, it was released April last year. There was certainly some pointers there in terms of the way in which ASQA can really improve the way in which we engage with the sector. Over the last 12 to 18 months or so, part of what the way in which we've given some of that consideration is to really clarify our role and regulatory purpose. And with that, we've very clearly articulating that purpose around our ensuring quality vets so that students, employers, the community and governments can have confidence in the integrity of national qualifications issued by training providers. With that, we see a shared responsibility, which we see very much as requiring a collaborative approach. And we set about setting out 6 very clearly defined strategic deliverables under that purpose, one of which is to engage and partner with our stakeholders constructively and with mutual respect. And I think that's touches on many of the comments that Alistair made there in terms of seeing that very much clearly as a role for the regulator to take in working with the sector and the entities that it regulates. It's also broader than that, though, including stakeholders. So, and for us in the vet sector, that's all states and territories, the 2 state-based regulators, and the variety of other stakeholders, including the peak sector bodies. So we've certainly made that very clear commitment around that engagement and partnering with the sector, and we're looking to do that in a variety of ways. I don't think that, including, for example, co-designing new approaches and tools, though within all of that, absolutely still seeing the role of the regulator and the independence of the regulator, but we really need that two-way relationship around our shared responsibility to inform the way in which we go about our role.
Thank you, Saxon. So, Valerie, what do we need for making a healthy relationship between the regulator and the regulator?
Thank you. First of all, let me say that I don't think of regulation as being about risk. I think of it as being about risk management. That's what a regulator is doing. And if we don't look at it in that way, then we're never going to have any providers out there who are willing to take a chance. And I'd make the point that smaller providers are often riskier, but as we've heard today, and as the Wells report showed, it's those smaller providers that have in many cases adapted best in this situation. So risk management, as far as I'm concerned, is what it's all about and what a regulator is doing. So a regulator is checking on risk management strategies, but also aiding and helping risk management strategies. Look, I mean, that question is raised a lot about the distancing. I totally support Alistair that you've got to be independent. You can't be bullied or sold out. And I mentioned that in the paper on the website. But I'd put it this way: with students, we're all familiar with education. With students, we are assessing, giving them feedback, we are helping all the time. But at the end of the day, we make a decision about whether they pass or fail. We do so with independence, but all the way through, we're working with them. If anyone's out there's done a PhD or supervising PhD students, you know exactly what I mean there. The relationship with the regulator is no different. But I would make that point that I think often our regulators in Australia are not supported well enough. They're often not supported with resources, and sometimes there's not even a government department that's willing to stand behind them. That does not make it easy. And it's in those situations that it's very hard for a regulator to maintain that independence. So I have some sympathy for the issues that have been raised here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. This next question is an amalgamation of a few questions. There have been kind of questions relating to the fact that when the pandemic hit, there were relaxations. For example, the code to allow providers to deliver online, for example, when you were a face-to-face teacher. And I think there has been a lot of things where there have been relaxed guidance to the regulations because of the fact that we're working in exceptional times. But as we progress back to being, well, as normal as we can be after the end of the pandemic, there will be a requirement to look again at when those providers move back to the more regular ways of doing things. So what would TEQSA's and ASPA's approach be to that transition, if you like, back to perhaps not totally normal, but to a more normal delivery of education? Alistair, do you want to take that first?
In doing so, I might somewhat challenge or clarify something that Valerie said when she made the distinction between risk and risk management. I don't see it as TEQSA's role specifically to risk manage on behalf of providers. They're managing their own risks. We are identifying and highlighting risks to the standards, and then we work with the sector in various ways through our different mechanisms in hopefully addressing those risks. But I just make that slight distinction there from our perspective. And then, well, I think one example, Steve, of what's happening right now is a decision by government just in the last week to extend fee relief to the sector, and that was announced by the Minister this morning. And everyone's been hanging off this, and we've been sort of caught in a bit of a pattern of administrative process, if you like. But that's one response, and we're part of that engagement with with government through the department, etc., and responding and communicating the sector's responses to the proposed cost recovery model, and the decision out of that has been a further deferral of fee waivers for another year, and then therefore cost recovery not commencing until January 2023. And that's essentially around the identification of ongoing risks to the sector and the capacity of the sector to actually handle the imposition of or the introduction of cost recovery, and for some providers very significant costs that come with that, given the current circumstances and the impacts of the pandemic on financial viability. So that's one example of where I think a responsive regulator is seeking to reflect the views and the positions and the posture, if you like, of the sector on particular issues to government for decisions, but also at the same time reaching its own independent kind of views or positions on what that means for its regulatory practice and model. More broadly, we're going to have to revisit our model. There's no question about that. There's the shape of the sector, or the nature of the sector, is undergoing such fundamental shifts now that already I can see that our legislated regulatory model is not going to service the nature of the sector post-pandemic. So we need to be thinking very clearly and closely about that right now.
Thank you, Alistair. Saxon, do you want to add anything to that?
Thanks, Stephen. Just a couple of things to add. I think it's absolutely right. We need to continue to be responsive to the environment in which we are regulating. And from that perspective, ASQA and TEQSA at the outset of the pandemic, as you mentioned, Stephen, really looked at the way in which we were working together around some of those areas of highlighted in the National Code in relation to international students. We had a decision earlier in the week from government about the return of international students, and that's again, another one of those opportunities. ASQA and TEQSA actually work very closely together on a variety of things, but even in responding to the way in which the pandemic response is looking at the opening of borders and the return of international students, we're already turned our minds to what that might mean for providers and the way in which we're both looking to jump in here at any stage, Alistair, but the way in which both regulators are looking to work with our respective providers around what that return looks like, acknowledging that full return of international students is going to take some time. So we're going to be looking to really understand what that looks like for providers over the coming months, and continue to be responsive and consider the opportunities for that flexibility while maintaining safeguards, I think is really one of the key aspects there. And again, that equally comes back to that level of engagement and collaboration with the sector, certainly on ASQA's part, to be able to work that through, and the points at which we'll be engaging with the sector about any review or any changes to that. That's I think the part of the ongoing conversation.
And I mean, the National Code's a good example. We're putting out a joint statement with ASQA, I think now, which clarifies that the government's decision to open the borders and allow those holding student visas to commence returning to onshore learning here is clearly going to take some time, and it doesn't mean that we turn off the flexibility kind of mechanisms that we put in place 18 months ago, and that we recognise that bringing back 160,000 or more students who are currently overseas who hold student visas, that's going to take 6 months, maybe a year, and we'll just review where we're at on the requirements around online learning, etc., or the flexibility around online learning through the course of 2022, and that's I think part of being responsive in a pandemic.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Valerie, do you want to add anything to what we've heard?
Not on that, but just to say that Alistair's quite right. I don't think any provider would be grateful for TEQSA to walk in and risk manage for them. And my point really is that if I'm a provider carrying risks and I say to my case manager, I'm managing those risks in this way successfully, I want TEQSA to give me a pat on the back. That's the point I should have made, and I didn't make it clearly enough. Thanks, Alistair, for that.
Otherwise, we'd find providers becoming rather quickly dismissive.
All right. More pats on the back, please, Alistair. That's what we need. There have been a few questions on in terms of a risk approach, and the fact that the earlier you have the data, the real-time data, the live data is important. And I assume that ASQA and TEQSA work together for dual providers, etc. in that. So where are we in that area in terms of getting earlier, if you like, real-time data? How are we approaching that, and can we get there? I'll take Saxon first, and then go to Alistair.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, it's a really, really good question, and so necessary. So there's some broader things happening in at a vet level. There's a variety. The whole of the vet reform agenda involves quite a number of aspects, but one of the key pieces of work is the vet data streamlining initiative, and so that is very much looking at the ability to have more. I won't say necessarily real-time data initially. It's taking steps to close the gap in the lag that we currently have quite considerably around vet data. So that's going to be a really valuable key component, but it's not the only component either. And so what we're looking at from ASQA's perspective around our own data strategy is the variety of ways we can actually be more proactive around the data that we obtain, the way in which we use that and analyse that data and intelligence more broadly. And it's one of the key, mechanical mechanisms between ASQA and TEQSA in terms of the way in which we share information and data as well. So it's a journey. There's no doubt about it. It's things that have been taking time. There's very much so from ASQA's perspective a deliberate focus in this area. It's occurring at a broader systemic level architecturally in the vet sector through that vet data streamlining initiative with the states and territories. And all of those things are going to certainly contribute to that ability to be more responsive with more current information and data.
Alistair.
Yeah, I just use again as an example the financial viability risk. And the most up-to-date data that we can rely upon at present is end of 2020 audited accounts. And so that's already almost a year old. And there we are producing, I'm speaking quite frankly and openly if you don't mind here, there we are producing individual risk assessments for providers based on an assessed risk of that's posing itself across the sector, financial viability, because of the impacts of the pandemic, and yet the data that we have access to is already quite dated. So we end up with a product that for the provider is telling them to suck eggs in some ways, which is, well, what are you telling us that we don't already know, based on audited accounts from a year ago? So, that's a pretty significant challenge for the regulator in responding to an identified high level of risk across the sector, going through significant churn and transition and pressure now. And that goes to one of our core functions in the end, protection of the interests of students who might be faced with the consequences of the closure of a provider. So that's a significant challenge for us, including with ASQA and our shared sort of dual sector providers. And it's something that we really need to grapple with. We're working with the department quite hard at the moment around a data project to try and ensure that the data is much more up to date and that we can get it in a more live sense. But we're going to have to think creatively as an agency in responding to some of these risks, and financial viability is just one of them, in obtaining and developing a live data analysis and response sort of capacity. And right now, that's something that's a challenge for TEQSA, as it is for, I think, most regulators across most sectors now, with the varying impacts of the pandemic.
Thank you, Alistair. We've got a question from a small provider here, and the question is basically that whilst small providers can often score high in TEQSA risk ratings, when they look at how they've supported their students during COVID-19, they don't feel it necessarily aligns with the risk rating. So would it be possible for TEQSA to be more transparent about the rating criteria? And what about smaller providers being able to be able to input into that criteria? Maybe they can, and maybe you are transparent, but can you just contextualize that for us, Alistair?
Well, as I understand it, through our, the risk assessment process that we do annually for, on behalf of and for and regarding individual providers, they do have an opportunity to have an input into the design, the carriage, and the result of that risk assessment. That would be the first point. But where we can be more transparent and collaborate more closely with a provider in that respect, especially with smaller providers who, in my short experience in this role, do tend to rely on those risk assessments more than, say, Monash University or the larger established providers, then we can and should do so. Secondly, partly because of the pandemic, and these lags and our capacities around getting a much more up-to-date feel for how a risk is playing out across the sector, we are changing we are going to change our risk assessment cycle. And this year, for calendar year 2021, the results of which will be provided to the sector during 2022 is a transition year, and then we plan to, and we've already informed the sector that we'll be engaging them on what our risk assessment cycle could and should look like, and what do we need to be doing as the regulator to improve that product and its offering and its serviceability and its value to providers. So that's something I look forward to engaging with, hopefully much more readily and not just remotely as we're doing today, over coming months with the sector on.
Thank you, Alistair. Now, Valerie, there's some interest in the article that you said, I think it's on your Facebook page or is posted somewhere. So I'm going to give you 1 minute to tell us about that article and, give us an elevator pitch. Why should we go to it and what will we find when we get there?
You've got me, I'm speechless. I don't know what to say to that. It's on my website, valeriebraithwaite.com, and it's just under hard lessons, I think, on the front page of the website. But it's explaining those 4 points, and those 5 points rather that I made are interconnected. And I think the most important thing, and I suspect I'm going to be a lone voice in saying this, so I'll say this is the thing I'll say again. I actually think the sector does need serious scrutiny at the time of re-registration. I think that it's to the benefit of everyone for that to happen. But I do think when there's a strong relationship between the case manager and the institution, the file can be rich with examples of how risks have been managed successfully. And really, that's the thing that we want in a pandemic. We want small institutions particularly, but also big ones, to be managed, showing how they're managing those risks. And I'll finish on this note because it's something I care a lot about, and that's about sexual harassment in the higher ed sector. I think we've done an appalling job of actually meeting that problem head on and doing something about it. I think we've slipped around and tried to have the paperwork looking good, but we haven't addressed the problem. So re-registration, tough re-registration, I would like to put a pitch in for.
Thank you very much, Valerie, and that brings us to 5 seconds remaining, so we've been very well. On behalf of everybody who's watching, can I thank all of the panel, and that's a wrap.